In just a moment, we are going to talk about one of the most compelling stories I have ever heard, and I think you'll agree. Creature from Jekyll Island, a second look at the Federal Reserve. And welcome back to Coast. I'm George Norrie. G. Edward Griffin, I'll call him Ed tonight, is a writer, documentary film producer with many successful titles to his credit. Edward is listed in Who's Who in America and is well known because of his talent for researching difficult topics and presenting them in very clear terms that all can understand. I've got to tell you, I've been reading his book, The Creature from Jekyll Island. It is fantastic. He has dealt with such diverse subjects as ancient Earth history, of course, the Federal Reserve System, terrorism, and the history of taxation as well. Here he is on Coast to Coast, full program tonight. Ed, how are you?
I'm doing well, George. How are you doing?
Good. You know, this is amazing because when you first wrote this book and published it in 1994, did you know what was going to happen? You must be a clairvoyant or something.
Well, actually, I'm not a clairvoyant, but I do know the players. I know and understand the game, and so I knew where it was going. You don't have to be a rocket scientist. In fact, I don't know if you've gotten all the way to the end of the book, but the second to the last chapter is called A Pessimistic Scenario. And I wrote that, as you pointed out, in 1994, as kind of a whimsical look into the future to see what could happen if there were no substantial changes made. Well, lo and behold, everything I wrote about is actually unfolding right now, including some of the language that I put into the mouths of some of my fictional characters. So it's not that I'm clairvoyant. It's just that, as I said before, I understand the game. I know what the Federal Reserve System is, and I know that it's basically a fraud. And when you understand that a fraud is a fraud, and you finally figure out how they play that fraud, and then you can figure out what's going to happen.
And you're one of the few mainstream journalists, I say mainstream because you've done a lot of incredible things, that understands that this is a push for a one-world government. And there's a theory, which we'll get into tonight with you, Ed, about how they plan to do this, because they need to topple the United States. They need to break us down in order to get this plan working, don't they?
Well, yes, they do. The United States has always been a serious obstacle to this new world order that they finally call it. You know, if you're going to run the world and you want all of the nations to be nice little boys and girls and behave themselves and do what they're told, you better not have any of them that are too big and strong. And so the object is to get all of the big, powerful components of this global government reduced and into some kind of financial crisis or a social crisis. And this is a strategy they actually talked about almost 100 years ago. How to bring this about, how to cripple the United States, how to get the American people to go along with a lower standard of living. What kind of crises would have to be artificially developed, they pondered, in order to scare the American people into accepting these things. All of this was done in a very scholarly fashion way back at the turn of the last century.
It made it sound that we all needed it, didn't it?
Oh, they thought we did. They really have a mad-on against what we call individualism. That was really what our nation was built upon in the beginning. These people are collectivists. That's the opposite of individualism. They wanted a collective system, all-powerful, a government at the top, small people at the bottom taking orders. They didn't want representative government of any meaningful nature. They wanted a rule by the elite, and it was all done, in their mind, for the benefit of the world. It was all done for the benefit of society. And so they said, somebody has to rule, might as well be us.
Before you explain Jekyll Island and in its context of this story tonight, this incredible story, let's go way back. Way back on this planet, Ed, those people who controlled by money, the money changers, the bankers of years gone back, they were the ones in power. It was the world of the haves and the have-nots. And this went all the way back to biblical times, didn't it?
Well, yes, I think it's always been that way, even before biblical times. It's kind of the natural habitat in a primitive society that the very few, the powerful few, rule the many. And in the primitive societies, of course, it's done with the power of the club or the fist. The strong man rules the weak man. And then finally it evolves into a militaristic system so that those with the most soldiers, with the most rifles and the most bayonets and the most powerful weapons rule. But then about 100 years ago, this whole idea of democracy crept into the world vocabulary, and starting with about the time of the French Revolution and the writings of Karl Marx, and all of this ferment was going on in Europe about how wonderful a socialist system would be. All of a sudden, nations and people began to think that it was the best thing for them to participate in their own political destiny. And so this idea of the rule of the people became very popular. And from that point forward, the real smart elitists and rulers decided that, okay, well, let's let these people play their silly games. Let's let them think that they're selecting their leaders, and here's how we can fool them. And so with the starting of the Communist Manifesto all the way from that point forward, a lot of this literature that you can get into if you have this research bent deals with how can we convince the masses to be content with being ruled and let them think that they are really in charge when in fact they're not. So it's kind of a game.
They need us content, don't they?
Excuse me. Yes, they definitely need us content. They want us to be content that no matter what happens to us, well, it's okay because we voted for our dictator.
When this country was formed, did we bring over the European monetary system at that time?
Well, actually, we did. Well, before the country was formed, we brought over all of the financial institutions from primarily England. And after the country was formed, the Bank of England was the dominant factor. I shouldn't say after the country was formed, after the Constitution, no. But during the prior period leading up to the Revolutionary War is really what I should have said. We were living under the shadow of the Bank of England. And so when the United States was created, we already had a central bank which was modeled after the Bank of England. It later became the Bank of Philadelphia. But we got rid of it and didn't have a central bank for a long time. And then it reared its ugly head again, and we had another central bank, and it ripped off the people and caused inflation and destroyed savings, and we got rid of it. And it came back a third time, and we got rid of it again. Andrew Jackson fought against the Bank of the United States, it was called, for the same reasons, because it was destroying people's savings through inflation, got rid of it. Then in 1913, we got another version of it. This time they called it the Federal Reserve System, and we haven't gotten rid of it yet, but we need to.
Who are the people I keep hearing about? The Rockefellers, of course, we heard about their oil when they were in this country, and they're still here, and the Rothschilds. Who are these people?
Well, the ones that created the Federal Reserve System back in 1910 is when the serious
plan started.
The plan started. The major banks of the United States were the dominant ones. We're talking about the J.P. Morgan Group and the Rockefeller Group primarily, but also well represented was Kuhn, Loeb and Company, which was one of the larger financial international banks in Wall Street, and they represented the financial interests of the Rothschilds in Europe. And then the Warburgs also in Germany and the Netherlands were well represented through the personage of Paul Warburg, excuse me. Max Warburg was his brother who ran the dynasty in Europe, but Paul Warburg was one of the founders of the Federal Reserve System. So at the very beginning, there was quite a strong international mix.
Now, these people, are their offshoot family members still around, still in control?
Well, that's a good question. I really can't answer that authoritatively. I don't know how much the control has remained in family hands or whether it has been corporatized or institutionalized. Mm-hmm. I really can't answer that. I think that as far as Europe is concerned, the Rothschilds still maintain a very strong control, although they go to great lengths, it seems to me, to make it appear that they don't. But we must remember that during the the heyday of the rise of the Rothschild dynasty, that was one of the ways that they were successful is by working through front organizations.
Absolutely. Nobody really even knew they existed or what they did. Stay with us. G. Edward Griffin, our guest. And tonight we talk about Creature from Jekyll Island.